Now, because the use of parole evidence is prohibited in cases where it would contradict, change, or add to the terms of a written agreement, that means that you can use it if it's not being used to do any of those things. For instance, and this is why I corrected myself when I mentioned ambiguity, if it's to simply explain something in the contract that might be ambiguous, then you're not adding, contradicting, or changing anything. You're simply explaining something. You're explaining what was meant by something to a court, and there may be situations where you would need to use outside evidence outside of the writing to do that. You can also use it to prove fraud, of course, because you would necessarily need to do that because the agreement's not going to represent the written agreement won't represent the fraud that took place. Or in the case of a contract being incomplete, sometimes you may have terms that are incomplete or ambiguous, in which case you have to use evidence outside the writing to explain or to complete those terms and to fill in the gaps. Now, the ability to use parole evidence really comes up not so much in this chapter with contracts generally, but more with specifically goods contracts, because as I mentioned before, the rules are a little bit different with goods contracts, and one of the rules that's different is that you don't have to have all of the terms spelled out in the offer and acceptance stage before you can have a contract. So you'll end up with contracts, as you'll see in the next chapter, that might be actually missing some terms like the price, or might have some ambiguous terms that need to be explained. So, and I'll come back to this in our chapter on commercial contracts, but there's a case in there where the issue was it was about the sale of trout, and the written agreement said that one company would buy trout from the other company when the trout were grown to be market size. But it didn't explain exactly what market size was. It didn't say if it was 12 ounces or 16 ounces. So that's a situation and an example of an ambiguous term that the writing doesn't explain, and so you would have to use parole evidence there. But for the most part, with a service contract, because everything has to be all your terms have to be clear from the beginning, you're not going to be in a situation where you're using parole evidence to explain ambiguities or things that are incomplete.